Welcome to CES 2021 and the panel Healthy Buildings, Healthy Lives. It's a pleasure for us to be here with you, and we are so excited to have this discussion. Todd Boucher, principal and founder of Leading Edge Design Group, is joining us, as well as Michael Don Ham, co-founder and CTO of Pure 365, Jordan Sun, Chief Innovation Officer for the City of San Jose, and I'm Limor Schifman, President of Keystone Tech Group, and I'll be the moderator here today. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start kicking off the stage by looking at the title of this session, Healthy Buildings, Healthy Lives. What does that mean to you? What does that mean for your businesses? What kind of interests are you bringing into this? This will help us get an understanding of the perspective that you're going to bring to the rest of the discussion. Todd, can we start with you?
Sure, of course. Thank you, Limor, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. So in our business at Leading Edge Design Group, we specialize in planning and design of smart buildings, which to me incorporates health and wellness. And to answer your question, I'd start in the inverse order. I think the first thing we have to do is we make an individual choice as to what healthy lives mean to us and choose what that means mentally, physically, and emotionally. But the built environment has a really critical role because our facilities are an enabler of those healthy lives for our occupants. And I think there are diverse pathways that a built environment can take to be an enabler of those healthy lives, but doing so successfully definitely requires change in how we ensure that health and wellness is incorporated into the design and operation of a facility.
Thank you, Todd. Don?
Yeah, hi, Limor. So, I mean, the title Healthy Buildings and Healthy Lives, so fitting what we've had to deal with this year, right? And I think for far too long, they've been seen as independent or separate things. But more than ever, I like to look at it as a micro and macro. Like each of us on this panel, we actually manage our own building that houses our inner self. And then we have the buildings that we spent most of the time in working before COVID. Now it's like mostly our homes. And then we all live in a town, a state, a country, and we on a macro level, it's the planet, right? So I think this topic is so important because if we get an understanding of what healthy lives truly means, it doesn't just extend to me, my family, but it actually extends to the health of the planet. And buildings and our homes are really key in facilitating that type of thought and mindset.
Wonderful. Thank you, Don. Jordan.
And just building on that, I really appreciate the idea of how you set the tone for 2020 for what buildings mean to ourselves, and it's very inspirational because I think early 2020, what a building meant to me was a shack, if not a mud hut in Afghanistan where I was. And the latter half of 2020, it is City Hall or my apartment. And so, from the city's perspective, we're the 10th largest city here in the US. We are the largest city in Silicon Valley. And I love this title of Healthy Buildings and Healthy Lives because it implies that we need to be human focused first and foremost, because it is the health of the people who occupy the buildings, but also the people who work, traverse, and interact in some physical or even mental form with these buildings. And here, particularly with San Jose, we have about 180 square miles that the city covers. We have over 46 high rises, but we also have an airport next to these high rises. And so it very weirdly defines what our downtown is, but that's not it. I mean, we have all these houses and other buildings, multifamily buildings that exist outside of the downtown area. And so really the way I look at buildings is I really look at the interaction of life and how civic or society comes together for our residents here in San Jose.
Wonderful. So appreciate the human factor that you're brought in to this conversation, and we're going to come back to that. But now let's take a look at the digitized element, because our environments are becoming digitized. We're becoming zeros and ones. So data is clearly key to enabling the vision of this connected and very human part of it, but it still requires the technology. It still requires that 0 and 1 capability. So how is data powering the present course and future possibilities to achieving this healthy built environment for the human being and for the healthy lives that you're describing. And Don, do you mind starting us off?
Sure, sure. I think this is such an crucial component of establishing what a healthy built environment actually is, because it's very hard to manage something if you don't know the data behind it, right? With anything. But as it pertains to healthy buildings or even homes, if you don't understand the challenges, like buildings have been so underventilated for the longest time, and now we're feeling the effects of that because we have microorganisms floating in the air, aerosolized viruses, and if you don't know the CO2 levels or the proxy data that shows that a building is safe or dangerous, it's very hard to manage. So I think as we move forward through the proliferation of lower cost sensors, we're going to be able to get more insight into our buildings, and that's going to provide the right insight for us to make every building, as Jordan said, the human factor should be the most important priority, even with all buildings, schools, and so that data will give us that insight to act on it.
I'm sorry, and Jordan, since he called you out, Jordan, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, and building on top of, once again, your comments about sensors, right? It's the data comes from the sensors, but then how does that tie in with the rest of the sensors? And so from a city's perspective, I look at, hey, look, there's been a great amount of push in the past at the height of smart cities, of IoT networks. I think there's some phenomenal movements right now with LongFi and other, and protocols being established by the big tech firms such as Amazon, all the way to blockchain players such as Helium. And so building that IoT network that is not only city, but regional and also maybe national and even international will be so important. I think the second part is then your users of who uses that data. And so building a universal dashboard or unified data systems that link so that, city planners and other folks who operate in industry can actually have a unified form of approaching this data and understanding and digesting it and then making decisions off of it will be also very important.
Thank you, Jordan. Todd?
Yeah, both great points by Michael and Jordan. I would build upon that. I think what we see in the built environment, to achieve that objective that Jordan is talking about of this integrated data source that has great visualization, you can communicate with transparency. I think that's a great hallmark of a smart building, a smart community, and of a healthy building. I think the challenge is that there is a lot of data available to us today in the built environment that most owners aren't able to take advantage of. And when we think about that from a health perspective, in order to make a built environment an enabler of that healthy life for an occupant, there has to be some element of personalization. And I think that we have the technologies available to enable that personalization. But as both Michael and Jordan said, what's really critical is that we have the mechanism to collect the data from those user devices or from those sensors and then do something meaningful with it. Right now, I think if we want to really take those important steps towards healthy lives and healthy buildings, then we have to be more invested in the built environment and how we effectively extract data out of the built environment, and then how we invest in using that in a really meaningful way.
And it looks, Jordan, like you might have a further comment on that. Do you have anything that you want to say in response further to what Todd just answered?
Yeah, I just want to say the emphasis is on inclusion also, as we think about these buildings, what are the disparities between, in buildings that are built for folks who, are more high net worth or larger companies versus buildings that are, a little bit more old school or diverse in the residents it serves. And we see that across with just building codes in general, right? Those who are able to adhere versus not. You see that with vehicles too, passing emissions tests. So.
True. Go ahead, Todd, please.
Go ahead, Todd.
Go ahead, Don.
Okay, I just wanted to echo what you said, Todd. I think the data can only get you so far. It's how you parse that out and bring meaningful insight that can be utilized is actually more important, right? And then some of the things we talked about before, what are key challenges? There's obviously the privacy issue, but that's a whole different thing. But the most important thing is to get sense, use the data, and provide actionable insight to have a positive impact on the health of the occupant of the building.
Yeah, I really like the word actionable, that Don's mentioning, because I think that when we look at buildings today, most often they're operated in a way that's reactive. And that if we can make a move to being more data-driven and more actionable, then we're making really, really important and positive steps toward creating healthy buildings, healthy communities, and smart buildings.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, all that data feeds into different systems. And as we've seen, most of us are spending between around 80% in buildings, let alone in the built environment. And there are a lot of opportunities, though, in terms of the technologies that are taking that data and making use of it in really interesting ways. I mean, some of them are what we're faced with right now, trying to come back from COVID. So what kind of sensor tech and IoT technology, Internet of Things technologies do we want to implement? In fact, I was introduced the other day to the Internet of Action, of Activity, of Action. I thought IOA, I was like, wow, I really like that. That sort of takes the point that you were just saying, Todd, and brings it right into what we're facing right now. And then there's also, how is healthcare going to be changing? It's distributed. It's using robotics. There are new educational opportunities for children. There are ways for to manage our environmental impact, all kinds of things. It's all data driven. So now that we have these capabilities, what are the technologies that you're paying attention to that are taking advantage of this data, and what kind of impact are they having on healthy lives and healthy living? And Jordan, if you don't mind kicking us off with this.
Yeah, like I said, I from a city's perspective, I see a lot of the opportunities still on the infrastructure side of things, right? And so, as I mentioned about inclusion, one of our big portfolios here, and it's part of our Mayor Sam Liccardo's efforts, has been an early proponent of the digital divide. And so when we look at some of the buildings here in San Jose, look, we've got fantastic buildings that have great fiber connectivity, right? And the residents are all plugged in. And then you've got other buildings here that we can barely get a cellular signal in, let alone think about giving it access to Wi-Fi. And so there are a lot of technologies out there, and it's really more so of rethinking what an ISP model looks like. And so, I'm very bullish on wireless ISPs. I'm really bullish on mesh networked internet. And all you need is that one little backhaul into someone's fiber that is at an economic scale that makes sense for these projects to scale. It's not just bringing connectivity to folks so that it's healthy building, healthy lives are accessible to all, but it's also then, once again, as I mentioned, the IoT network. Look, I think folks like at Helium are doing fantastic things in not only securing privacy, but also creating economic incentive-driven ways to build out IoT network nodes that otherwise I think you've seen a lot of folks haven't really done enough. They usually try to force an opt-in, right? And there's a lot of press around one of the particular big tech companies with this awkward opt-in moment right now. And so, I'm really excited for the future of this, but it starts with connectivity of getting folks access to broadband internet. And then it builds upon that with this IoT network that can work off the backhaul with folks being connected.
Yeah, wonderful, Jordan. Don, why don't you go next?
Sure. So the technologies, you said 80%. I think post-COVID, probably we're spending 95% plus indoors, which make it that much more important that we're focusing on the health of the environment, right? And I think these days, I focus, Pure 365 really focuses on the residential sector. So what we're seeing in the industry is using the sensors, using smart controls, and then using hardware as it pertains to fresh air ventilation, advanced filtration, humidity control, all important aspects of indoor air quality, and creating auto triggers within one integrated platform. We're very early in the game, but with even the smart home industry, there's a lot more cohesion going on now. So I think over time, things will really improve where these types of things work in the background to optimize the CO2 levels or keep the CO2 levels down, keep the ultrafine particulates down, really impacting physical health of the occupant.
Yeah, wonderful, Don. And Todd, you may be on mute, but please.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Yeah, so Don, and just to add to what both Don and Jordan said, I think if we use something like San Jose, as an interesting use case from our perspective, something that we pay a lot of attention to on the technology side, are technologies that support the integration of community and work and personal life. And I think there are a lot of examples of that. And when Jordan brought up the LP-WAN technologies before that enable this longer distance of communication between systems. And as we think about living healthy lives in and outside of work, the integration of technology that moves between those aspects of our lives is really important. We just talked about data, but I do think it's worth repeating. The technology I think will have the greatest impact that can unlock the value of all of these technologies we're talking about is the utilization of data analytics and machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think a mistake we see people make often is that they focus on, buying a technology that solves a specific problem without understanding how they can extract more value out of that by using the data from it. So I think what can enable, the true value of smart buildings or the smart technologies that we're talking about is having the right platform for analytics, machine learning on the back end. So that's a technology we're watching very closely and doing a lot of work with.
Mm-hmm. And are there any, to anyone on the panel, are there any particular use cases that you're finding particularly exciting with regard to some of the technologies that you're seeing out there? Don, Todd?
Yeah, I could jump in on one real quick. So, just a simple example I think is easier for people to understand is that, when we're implementing technology, we also have to make it affordable. And, Jordan talked about inclusion as well. And so a way we see analytics being used is on the energy side. So using historical data, weather data, occupancy data to create predictive models of what energy utilization should be in a building, and then comparing that to actual. And anytime it exceeds that threshold, then you're able to sort of dig in and understand the why. And to go back to Don's point on creating actionable insight, I think that's an example of creating actionable insight. And you can apply that use case to indoor air quality or shade control for daylight. So I think those are some great examples that we're seeing that are providing value sort of on day one.
Yeah. Don?
Yeah, I have a great use case as it pertains to water. A lot of people don't, I think we take it for granted here in the US, but recently I read a study that the UN Water published really an alarming statistic that in less than 2 decades, maybe 2 out of every 3 people on the planet could face a shortage of clean water. And that's a major crisis, right? That's on par with what's happening now. Like if you can't get clean water, right? Just imagine that. And then 10% of homes in the US waste over 90 gallons a day through leaks in the homes. So the latest technology that we're seeing is like water monitoring, being able to mitigate against these types of leaks, and saving water is so important. And Jordan, I'm sure you're interested in that for your municipality, right? Things like that can save water.
Yeah, it's that's actually one of the top use cases right now is water conservation. And we have our Better Buildings program that is basically figuring out how to reduce collective greenhouses. We also have our zero net carbon buildings. And so we have all really do think water is one of the most actionable, immediate things that we can deliver on, both for residents as well as for your, office type of spaces. And so when we think about those IoT networks, that's an immediate cost savings, right? And thinking about how can I incentivize folks to say adopt sensors, adopt IoT networks, and help build out those nodes. I mean, nobody wants to be stuck with a $900 water bill on top of the moment, your state is facing a freshwater crisis, and there's a fire going on.
And the health aspect, if you have moisture in your home, it breeds mold and it causes asthma and allergies. So it's definitely a health aspect to it too.
Yeah, and you're all touching on something that I think is a great thing to ask next, which is sometimes when we're looking at what we can accomplish with a healthy building, for example, or a healthy city, sometimes what is necessary is actually diametrically opposed to supporting a healthy life. And so when you're looking at how you balance between what is possible, the use of the technologies, and actually achieving it, how do you value things? How do you make that distinction? What are some of the ways to determine and make a choice between those two elements? Todd, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, Limor. I think this is a great question and a really relevant one, because if we look at buildings, historically, the point that you made about this dichotomy between building performance and occupant experience, it really does exist, meaning that if you're trying to prioritize building performance through sustainability or energy efficiency, that often came at the sacrifice of occupant experience or occupant comfort in some way. So I think that's a real tension that exists inside of buildings today. And we've talked about it a lot, but I do believe that the right utilization of data and the right data intelligence strategy helps bridge that gap. If you're going to start that conversation today, and I'm interested to hear Don and Jordan's take on this. I think where we've seen organizations be successful is they first start by just understanding what data is available to them. We talked about many facilities being run in a really reactive way. So they have to start to make the shift to being more data driven. And when they do that, they can begin to understand how to find that balance where you can provide that personalization, you can provide the occupant experience that you really desire, but you're not sacrificing, the performance of the building in the process. So it starts with I think not as much technology, but actual manual process work that you have to do internally to help identify those opportunities and what data is available to you.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Don?
Yeah, this is an important topic because, I like to explain to people, to create a healthy building, it costs money. Like if you're bringing fresh air from the outside, it's going to cost energy. You have advanced filtration to, purify the air, take out the pollen and pollution from the air coming in. It's going to cost you the cost of the advanced filters, right? And so the way that I like to explain it to people is we really, at the beginning of the session, we talked about how everything should be human focused first. Everything else goes after that, right? If any year we've learned this year the value of human life. So with that being said, I see right now the way that technology plays a role is when the building is occupied, everything will be optimized for the health of the occupant. And when the building is unoccupied, then it goes into energy conservation mode. And I think that's a broad stroke explanation of it. But as technologies advance and we're able to get things like ERVs and HRVs into commercial buildings and reduce those energy costs, I think we can find an optimal level where we're focusing on the health of the occupant while keeping energy costs low. But, that's the constant battle between energy use and the health of the occupant, right?
Yeah, and Don, I'm sorry for a second. Do you mind spelling out those acronyms that you just used?
Oh, ERV and HRV, they're called heat recovery ventilators. They're more seen in residential applications, but in the winter, if you open your window, you're losing all the heat energy you've used, right? The HRV, what it does is it transfers the heat from the outgoing stale air to the incoming fresh air, usually around the 80-90% rate. So it's like opening your window, but you're losing only 10% of your heat. And so if those types of technologies find their way to commercial applications, we're able to decrease the penalty energy cost of maintaining a healthy environment.
Yeah. And actually, I'll bring this in, and then for Jordan, curious to hear your perspective, but what a city's often faced with also are these like District 2030, like the requirements to be net zero carbon neutral by 2030, 2050. How's the municipality balance all of this? And that may not be go toward what you were going to say, but I'm curious about that aspect as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, look, it's definitely okay to start big and go small. I would say, look, the cities have a lot to do in terms of balancing those visions, but also taking feedback from several stakeholders, right? Folks who are residents to also the developers and the owners or investors. And so I want to take a step higher where, look, before we even talk about what the city can do, I think investors and those who hold these asset classes need to consider that too. My first job back in New York was in commercial real estate private equity, and I just remember these highly leveraged deals. And so they're very short term in terms of, I need to meet certain requirements in order to service debt at the very minimum, but deliver, outsized IRRs. And so when you think about the whole fundamental model, we need to make this good for business and we need to make it good for investors. So ESG type of REITs are obviously things that are being considered. And I just want to throw out there, there's a great professor at Harvard, Professor, Joseph Allen, with the Department of Environmental Health, and they have, their 9 foundations of healthy buildingnomics. Folks talk about here: ventilation, air, thermal health, moisture, dust, et cetera. And so these are all things that we need to consider in terms of refining the financing, the investor-focused model, and I think that will flow back ultimately into what we see reality on the ground.
That's wonderful. And so now taking a look at, let's bring in that human factor also with this last question. So when you're looking at what is possible for what the city officials have to do, developers, technology developers, as you're looking at this, what should they be doing, and also being able to take care not only about the technology, but also of the human beings? And so Todd, Jordan, why don't we continue please on that one, and very briefly, and then we'll ask Don and Todd their thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with communication, right? And there's always this tension with the human factor between people's views and perspectives. So I think the focus is, look, this is good for the environment, right? This can produce economic activity. I think by 2030, technically, we can produce like $3 trillion worth of annual returns if we invest in, healthier urban transformation outcomes. And the third part is figuring out how people get to and from buildings, and the environment outside of these buildings are really important too. And so I want to stop there and think it's not just about the building, but healthy lives involves also the surroundings of these buildings and the entire ecosystem.
Right, perfect. Don?
It's a great point. There has to be an ROI for everybody, right? So healthy buildings, when you look at the ROI, it's more productivity, less sick days. There's many ways to look at it. For the individual, when we talk about solutions and how to make the built environment healthy, we talk a lot about it being an investment and not an expense, because it's going to pay back later on in life with a healthy life filled with longevity and being able to do things well into your advanced age, right? And so people don't think about these things, and we got to really be able to communicate those things well.
Wonderful, Don. Thank you. And Todd?
Yeah, I would just add, I think Jordan and Don both making really important points, and I would just add that when we think about occupants and healthy lives, I think, if anything, people want a sense of agency. And even if they're coming to the workplace or if they're working from home, but especially in our buildings, they still want to maintain that sense of agency. And the built environment's job, if we want to make people their most productive selves, as Don said, their most fulfilled selves, we have to really empower that sense of agency. And I think the good news is the technology exists that enables us to do that allows us to design buildings that can provide that sense of agency and that personalization. But as specifically as a design community, as an ownership community, Jordan mentioned investors, we have to really, I think, evolve in the process and how we are thinking about incorporating that agency into the design process. Because if we follow a very traditional invest, plan, design, build model, sort of left with what we've always had. But do you think it takes an evolution from industry? And in a conversation like this, I think helps us do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Todd, Don, Jordan, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your knowledge. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you to all of you, our audience, for being here with us, and please enjoy the rest of CES 2021.